Okay, excellent. So from 2 to about 2:45, I will be presenting, and I will be talking about, you know, tips that folks could use for advancing their Reynolds history research. I'll be looking at sort of two main general areas. One is of just traditional research, looking at old-fashioned records, etc., and looking at some unique things that exist in the sort of Reynolds history research domain in particular, and focusing on things that we can do online, because more and more great records are becoming available online. And then in a second part, I'll be focusing on how Reynolds families are using YDNA to advance their research as a sort of supplement to traditional research. So bear with me as I tee this up. Okay. Can I get thumbs up if you see my screen? It should say tips for advancing. Excellent. Good. And it kind of minimizes that. Okay. I have presented in past reunions and other meetings, other fora related to RFA. I've done sort of deeper dives into YDNA research. And so I'm going to touch on that a little bit, but only as it fits into the wider topic of kind of what we see. Because, being involved deeply with RFA and the Reynolds YDNA project, I'm in touch with a lot of people that are looking into their particular lines. And I want to try to share some things that I've seen from my vantage point. Okay. So, and what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to focus almost exclusively on things that you can do from your own home. And so we're going to look at strategies that you can do when you're at home, whether you're at home because you can't afford to travel or health doesn't allow you to, or you're just busy with your kids and the only time that you can research is when everybody else is sound asleep at night and you're in your basement on your computer. So I'm going to really focus on things that come up in Reynolds history research in particular. And two parts, looking at traditional research and looking at issues related to YDNA Reynolds research. So first, looking into traditional suggestions I'm going to go through in more detail related to traditional research. First off, everyone should join the Reynolds Family Association. As we've talked about before, there are great resources on the website, etc. It's a community of genealogists and Reynolds family historians that goes back a long, long ways, and there's a deep well to draw from. Second, I'm going to talk in particular about one author, Colonel Stephen Frederick Tillman, who published a couple of very large Reynolds family history books in the middle of the 20th century. And those have done some very interesting things to Reynolds genealogy, not all of which are helpful. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk through some of the fantastic resources that are now digitally available on Family Search, the LDS Family History website, because they're really fantastic resources there that even weren't there a couple of years ago. And I want to make sure all family history researchers know that they're there and how to access them. I'm going to say just a little bit about how diving deep into local history and local geography does indeed help identify where Reynoldses have been, coming from and going, and what we've seen in some of the lines we're looking into. I'm going to talk a little bit about something we all can do, and that is helping each other by doing peer reviews of each other's, Reynolds ancestors. And I want to flag a couple of excellent websites that are available. Okay, so first off, I suggest everyone join RFA. Most of you are already in RFA. In a lot of today's sessions, we've already talked through many of these things. Great resources on the website, etc. Please, there's a Google form where everyone can have their most distant Reynolds ancestor added to our website, etc. Second, I want to caution everyone about the research that has been published in Colonel Tillman's books. Please hold up your hand if you have found your ancestors in one of these books, or if you've come across these books and identified that, oh, look, my line goes back to a fellow named Christopher Reynolds. If you are a Reynolds from the southern United States, you've probably found your ancestors in one of his two books, and he did a lot of work, certainly. And these two books tie most Southern Reynoldses to Christopher Reynolds. Other resources say, oh, Christopher was the brother of Robert of Boston, and John, of Watertown, and James of North Kingstown, and they're all connected in in one big family. And these were the main resources available to Reynolds family historians for a long, long time. Lineage societies, you see DAR, I haven't seen SAR applications, but I've seen dozens and dozens of DAR applications that are accepted based on the fact that they were published in these books alone. Well, there are lots of problems with what has gone into these Reynolds history books by Colonel Tillman. Really, the only part of the issue is nobody knows where he got any of his information. There are very few sources cited in these entire, hundreds of page books. Really, the most specific he gets into the sourcing is what's here on the cover page, this little paragraph that says, in conducting this research, I looked at family Bibles, census data, and, Revolutionary War, pension applications, etc. And that is the basis for all of his conclusions in these entire books. Further to that, he didn't explain why there are differences between one of his books and the other, which have very different conclusions on the same ancestors and families and groupings. And if one looks through the decades worth of RFA newsletters, you see dozens and dozens of RFA members over decades saying, oh man, this guy got my family all wrong. Here's an article, I'm setting my family straight. So we find that again and again in RFA, Reynolds recollection articles in particular. And just being involved in RFA, I hear our members all the time say, oh man, these books got my line all wrong. Unfortunately, these lines were then the basis of what went into Ancestry when everybody started putting their information there, a decade or so ago. Okay, so my recommendations for everyone is only use his books as hints and go through everything and verify step by step, generation by generation, what your lineage is. Okay, I hope I hope that that was clear. Be careful with this resource. Next, I want to point out, my next tip is to learn how to find and how to use the newly online records. Of course, these aren't new records because they're hundreds of years old, but there are fantastic local records now available at familysearch.org. You know, Ancestry, it's a great scaffold site. It's a great place to start. It has a lot of the sort of framework records, censuses, etc., to get you started. But most records are not digitized and are not there yet. Old genealogists, you know, Marion Hobart Reynolds, we've talked about his books, you know, would pound the pavement, go to courthouses, archives, etc., to actually look these, you know, to do actual research. And you know, the Genealogical Society of Utah, the LDS Church has microfilmed millions of local records from courthouses all around the country. You used to have to order these by microfilm, and I'm certain many people on this call have experience with that. And you had to wait weeks for the microfilm to arrive, and you went and to read it in the Family History Center. So now a lot of these records are online and accessible through Family Search. You know, these are probate records, land records, annual property tax records for many, many, many counties all around the country. You can get court proceedings that talk about, you know, doing the daily business of administering the counties all over the country. You know, these are available now online. You can access them from your basement. You know, you log into the Family Search site. You can click on catalog up in the top. You type in the location that you're looking for records. In this case, and in the example I'm going to give, I was looking for Reynolds ancestors that were in Adair County, Kentucky. And you can just filter for only the records that are online. And you know, you hit search and you can pull up for example, the deed records. And I'm just going to walk through how one can access these in a very simple way. So once you get to the deed records, something you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look first at the index, and you're going to, you know, open up the index file, and you're going to look for your Reynoldses or whichever ancestors you need to find information on. In this particular case, I was looking up some ancestors in Joe's line, because his line had ancestors that came very close to my line, and we wanted to see, you know, where they you know, were working and living in the same area. So, you know, in the index, we found these two transactions, one from 1806, one from 1811, you know, with William and his wife, Jane Reynolds. And this was selling land to William Settles in, you know, 125 acres along the Green River in Adair County. So then once you've looked up where this is in the index, then you find book C and book B in, you know, in the files over here. And so that's step 3 over here. And then you can pull up the actual deeds, again, online from the comfort of your computer room. Okay, so here's the deed that I was looking for. And, you know, how does this help you? Well, of course, they're the principals. It says the names of the people we're looking for. Here's William Reynolds, and it says, and his wife, Jane. And importantly, it says even though this is in Adair County, Kentucky, it says they are of the state of Tennessee because they were in the process of moving at that time and selling off their land. There's all sorts of good information in these original records, you know, the quantity of land, exactly where it's located. Did they sell it at market price? Or did they sell it for $1? You know, if they sold it to someone for $1, they're probably a family member or something like that. You get the names of close family associates of theirs, you know, who had adjoining land are often named. Who are the witnesses? Who are the deeds transferred to and from? A lot of times there would be a series of transactions between the same people over years or decades. And you can take and these often have the physical description of the land, the dimensions, and you can use that information to then locate exactly where your ancestor lived, you know, along a particular stream in a particular part of a county. And before I go into examples, I want to make sure I'm doing okay on time. Yeah, so here's just one example. And this is in my particular Reynolds line. I was looking through documents in Pittsylvania County and found that there was in the deed book not a land transfer, but there was actually a libel case between some of my known family, which was a Rachel Wilson, and a Richard Reynolds, who may or may not be related to me, I don't know. But a court case was brought against Richard Reynolds by Rachel Wilson and her father the case was brought against Richard Reynolds for scandalously belying Rachel Wilson to some men in the town. So I don't know, he was gossiping or saying bad things about my fourth great grandmother. And I'm glad that a case was brought against him. A, because that's not a nice thing to do, and B, it left a record of my ancestors connecting with some Reynoldses in Pittsylvania County. So, you know, here's a record, and then one can use records like this and see who was living right in this area and what types of, you know, exactly where their land was located to distinguish, look, are these Reynoldses connected to my John and Rachel Wilson in particular or not? There happened to be multiple John Wilsons living in that area. So we needed to use these local records to parse out the land to see, you know, if this was likely a real connection between my Wilsons and the Reynoldses. So from those land descriptions that I showed you in the, you know, in the deed, one can map out exactly what the land was shaped like and exactly where the land was located. So what you see here, all of the pink land was owned by someone named Robert Walters. And in 1781, 82, he sold the black land to a William Reynolds. This is in southeastern Pittsylvania County. Okay, so this was transferred to a William Reynolds. William Reynolds, in his will, parsed this land out to his sons, which included a Richard Reynolds that was in the libel case on the previous slide. And so I was looking at, does a John Wilson live near this Richard Reynolds in southeast Pittsylvania County? And so I started mapping out all of the land of the various John Wilsons. And I found that one of my John Wilson's pieces of land fit into this piece like a cookie cutter. And therefore, my John Wilson was actually living right next to, in the entire county, my John Wilson was right next to this particular Richard Reynolds. And all of this was found just using online deed records that are available to anyone from the comfort of their basement. So that's, you know, I'm encouraging everyone, check out these online records on Family Search. Also, diving deep into the local history and the geography and the migration routes can help a lot. In the case, Joe, you're familiar with, of course, William and Jane Milliken. You know, in their case, Joe knows, he hits a brick wall with William Reynolds, who was, living in a particular part of Kentucky and also Tennessee. And so we're at a brick wall with William Reynolds, but we know William Reynolds married a Jane Milliken. And we know that there are James Millikens living in the immediate vicinity. And well, James Millikens were much better documented. They owned more land. One of them was I forget, a captain in the Revolutionary War and left a series of documents about his life and where they lived. And so with this, we can trace, this Reynolds family, from where they were in Bedford, central Tennessee. We can trace them back to Adair, south central Kentucky. We can trace them and their associates back to far eastern Tennessee in the decades before. And this is where the trail goes dry with William Reynolds. But with the extended Milliken family, who intermarried with another family of Beards that also lived in these same locations, we can trace that the Millikens and the Beards had come from, in particular, the Valley of Virginia, so Augusta County, etc. And that is a well-known migration route that many Scots-Irish, but also others, took down. Actually, they called it up the Valley of Virginia, going southward into Greene County from Augusta County. A lot of the Scots-Irish that were living in the Valley of Virginia had come, through Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and before that, ports of Philadelphia and the port of Newcastle, Delaware. My point is, use cluster strategies to, when you're at a brick wall with one person, look at the wider family and see what you can find from the associates and where they may have come from, and explore all of those using the online records we talked about a little bit. Something else I want to encourage is everyone to look at the list on the RFA website of most distant Reynolds ancestors and find a Reynolds listed there that maybe lived in the same geographic area as your Reynoldses did. And you can be in touch with the person that has listed that ancestor. And I would suggest doing a sort of peer review, or, working with them and doing independent research on their line to to see what you find. In particular, if their line lived in the same geographic area, it can help you parse out your Reynoldses from their Reynoldses. Okay. I also want folks to be aware of some great resources that are available online. There's one particular Reynolds research website run by Mary Frances Eggleston. Mary Frances, do you happen to be online right now?
Still good.
Okay. I think not, but anyway, check out this website, Reynolds PA to VA. She has thousands of, well, at least hundreds of very well documented Reynoldses. Her focus is on Reynoldses of the Mid-Atlantic and sort of Virginia area, but she has excellently documented research on her website. There are also some other websites here that I recommend for the various purposes listed here. For sake of time, I won't talk through each of them. Okay. I have, 15 minutes or so. In this next section, I'm going to introduce the concept of using YDNA for Reynolds family research. It's a great additional type of evidence. You can use YDNA just like you would use, land records or probate records. It is just another set of information that can give you supporting or contrary evidence to any genealogical theory you'd have. I'm going to talk through a couple lessons we've learned from the last 20 years in the Reynolds YDNA Project and give you some pointers on how you can use YDNA to compare to other Reynoldses. Okay. So, for example, if you are researching Reynoldses in South Central Kentucky and you find a deed from a William Reynolds, in one case the deed was for a mortgage for the ferry barge he operated on the Cumberland River. And well, that William lived pretty close to my Reynoldses. I want to know if he's related. But the traditional records do not give us any evidence related to that. And so we need to look for new types of evidence. Let's say I know someone that descends from that William Reynolds, and he can do a YDNA test, and I can do a YDNA test. So there are three types of DNA tests you can do. You can do an autosomal test, which gives you information about all your ancestors going back a couple generations. You can do a mitochondrial test that tells you about your maternal line going way back in time. Likewise, you could do a YDNA test that only males have Y chromosomes, so only males can do YDNA tests, and YDNA tests only give you information about your father's line. So, who can do a YDNA test? Only males can. So if you're a researcher, if you're a male, you can test yourself. If you're a female and you want to do a YDNA test, you would have to test a brother or a male cousin or an uncle or a male representing that line. The YDNA test can tell you, even a low resolution test can tell you who you are generally related to. Also, a low resolution test can also tell you who you are certainly not related to. When you have a lot of people that are matching, usually you need higher resolution, that is more expensive tests, in order to start to sort out the details of how these lines relate. And that would be the topic of an entire discussion on its own. So I can't go into the details on that, but here's an example of what we found in South Central Kentucky. The Reynoldses that lived in these blue areas, these Reynoldses, who were direct Reynoldses and some associated families, lived in those locations. There are other Reynoldses that lived a little bit to the north in what became Adair County. From YDNA testing, we know that my Reynoldses, which are the ones living down here, do not match the Reynoldses living just north of that location. Okay. We've talked about the fact that some of these books don't stand up to traditional genealogical proof standard. We've also found that the Tillman books, which say everyone descends from Christopher Reynolds, also do not stand up to the YDNA test standard. We are finding that the evidence we're finding supports the fact that many of those old traditional lineages are not correct. Here I distinguish the Tillman publications from Mr. Marion Hobart Reynolds's publications, which are on the RFA website. We have found that Marion Hobart Reynolds's publications have withstood the test of YDNA evidence, in that we have descendants, including on this very call, that are descendants of Robert of Boston. You know, for example, using Marion Hobart Reynolds's lineage information, and they find that they are YDNA matches. The same has been the case with Marion Reynolds's publications about John of Waterton. We find that many people using those resources find that they are indeed YDNA matches. So, you know, real quick, YDNA test costs $100 to $350, depending on how sort of precise and how detailed the test that you take would be. You can upgrade over time if you find you need a higher resolution test. In these slides are you know, go more into the detail of how we use those results and how we would interpret them. The key thing is, and we've masked the names of these participants for privacy reasons, but the key thing, if you're in the Reynolds YDNA project, you can see the results screens like this. And the key thing is how you're grouped. For example, the folks in the blue group on the top all are family matches to each other. The folks in the yellow group in the bottom are all matches to each other, but the top group men are not at all matches to the bottom group. They are different Reynolds families entirely. And this goes way down into the weeds on how far back the groups match in time, but that's outside the scope of today's discussion. When you get your YDNA results, you might find that you have lots of Reynolds matches. That's good news. Sometimes we can parse out exactly how you relate to each other genetically. Sometimes you'll find you have 0 Reynolds matches. Maybe you have lots of other matches, they're just not named Reynolds. That could mean that there's been an adoption in your line, could be, and the surname doesn't match the YDNA, could be. It could also be that your Reynolds line is just under-tested, in that you were the first person to test among your cohort, and it could be that future Reynolds men will show up to match you genetically also. In some cases, people also have 0 or very few matches of any name, and that could be because they have just a very unique genetic lineage, to keep it simple. Sometimes people find that they don't match any Reynoldses, but they match dozens of people, of men of a particular other name. It could be, you know, I wrote McIlvaney here. It could be any name. In that case, it is likely that there was an adoption somewhere in that line, but you can't say that certainly in every case. We'd look into any particular case before coming to that conclusion. Here are some, you know, in these other slides, we don't have time to go through them in detail, but these are resources and suggestions for going into the details, where you would get resources to learn to understand your results. The names of you know, YouTube presenters, teachers are listed here. Nancy and myself, we administer the Reynolds YDNA Project. We are great resources for you to reach out to with your questions. I'd also suggest that perhaps, quarterly going forward, we could have Zoom calls with folks that are interested to talk about maybe particular matching YDNA groups, or just to answer questions that folks might have. Okay. Yeah, this is just to point out that something I had mentioned before. We have scholarships available for testing old world Reynoldses. So if you are a Reynolds that traces back to the British Isles, or if you match a Reynolds in the British Isles, we have scholarships available to fund, moving up to higher level testing for Reynoldses around the world, because a lot of Reynoldses are trying to get beyond their immigrant ancestor. Here's a picture. You can't see the details, but this is a marker analysis of all of the 350 or so YDNA tested Reynolds males. This, I won't explain all of it, but it shows, for example, which Reynolds families are very closely related. I'm the green fellow right here. Everyone's has codes for privacy purposes instead of their real names. I am the green fellow right here. And so these people that are the other numbers that are close to me are my closer family, including, my known fourth cousin, for example, and then some other slightly further removed Reynolds family. And then you see how my family connects to other not Reynolds named family, but that branch off is something like 600 years ago. So we match those non-Reynoldses before surnames became hereditary. I match these Reynoldses after surnames became hereditary. And working in the project, you can go down the rabbit hole on things like this. Okay, I won't talk through all of these, but this is just an example of how we start off looking at lineages and then eventually can connect men on the other side of their brick walls using YDNA markers when we don't have traditional records and we don't know the names of the ancestors, but we know the names of the YDNA markers, so we can pair people together structurally. This is a great way to, this slide is a great way to understand YDNA connections. I won't talk it through here, but for anyone watching the recording in the future, you can pause here and examine. This is made by a fellow named David Vance, who was recommended in one of the earlier slides. Okay, and here I sort of lay out things we've talked about earlier in this session, how we can and should be using YDNA to identify and differentiate and assimilate different RFA lines. And we've been working on that over the last several years. Again, make sure your most distant Reynolds ancestors are listed with RFA. Test yourself, test your male Reynolds brother or cousin. Encourage people in other parts of the world, particularly the UK, where we find other Reynoldses, to do YDNA tests. Okay, I think we have like 2 minutes or so. Do people have questions? I'm going to offer, if you have,
I have a question.
I'm going to offer, if you have quick questions, we can hit them now. If you have longer questions, I can cover them at the end of the program. I'm available to stick around and would be more than happy to answer questions in detail. Yeah, Paula, go ahead.
Well, I have two sisters and my father and his two brothers now dead. And I have two male cousins on dad's side, but they're Harmons. So how would I proceed with the DNA testing?
Yeah, good question. You would need to find or go back in your family to a Reynolds named cousin. So you said your cousins through your dad, it's still another female line because they're Harmons, not Reynolds. You would have to find a Reynolds named male cousin, even if it's a second cousin or a third cousin or a fourth cousin, in order for them to participate in this group. And Paula, we can talk offline or at the end of the entire session to make sure that I answer your question that I can fully answer your question.
No, you did. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sure thing.
Tommy, can I make a comment?
Nancy, please go ahead.
For those of you that have YDNA kits in the project, please go and make sure you have a most distant known ancestor listed. And we don't want speculation. We want documented, even if it's just to your dad, then if that's all you know for certain, that's what you enter. And I can put an example of, there's not a lot of space to put a lot of information, but if you could put the ancestor's name and maybe a B to stand for born and a year, a location, a D for the death date if you know it, and a location. And then if you still have some room, you can put M and put their wife's name. If you don't know the last name, just the first name, it just helps differentiate them.
Yes.
And I'll tell you why that's important in just a minute. But while you're in there, updating your profile, also put the country of origin. And I would say the majority of the kits, we don't know the country of origin. I'm looking for it myself for my Reynolds kit. But technically, it's not correct to put United States, because that really is part of your answer for your most distant known ancestor. I think what Family Tree DNA thinks when you put United States is that you are an indigenous people. So if you don't know, leave it unknown.
Yeah, good.
And I want to tell you why this is super, super important. In fact, now when you log into your kit, it is giving a reminder about the most distant known ancestor, is that there's a beta tool that I mentioned in my breakout group that is trying to put dates with the unique markers for your family line that is part of the big Y. And they are trying to do a timeline now to tell you what a time frame of when that mutation may have been part of your family line. Does that make sense?
Yes, the tools for interpreting YDNA are becoming more and more mature, and that's really helpful.
So if you have a big Y, you can go to Family Tree DNA and you can check out the Discover tool. That's the tool they're building right now. It is in beta, but they need those. They need that information to make, accurate information gives us accurate results. Anyway, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Nancy. I am going to be available at the end of our agenda today for more discussion questions. If folks have it on the topics I just covered, would be more than happy to do that. So can we end this recording?